If you're a fan of these three teams, then the NBA play-in has been a problem. Whether it was this year, last year, or the year before that, your favorite team was in the play-in at least once. Before I begin, this is not a video to state that there should not be a play-in, because I honestly welcome it due to the good basketball it's brought throughout its creation, along with the competitiveness of the NBA becoming more prevalent, with teams having a better chance to make the playoffs. However, as with most things, there are always drawbacks. That main drawback of the play-in ended up being that it makes mediocre teams convince themselves that they have a chance of making some noise, when in reality, they don't. This caused them to hold on to players or assets in general, resulting in them losing their value over time, and before it's too late, they're getting traded for second-round picks and you're left feeling regret. The three teams I want to talk about are the Atlanta Hawks, the Brooklyn Nets, and the Chicago Bulls, all being the main three teams that have decided to stay put at the deadline in regard to specific players that were expected to be traded. Going into the deadline, all three were expected to make some move that would determine what direction the team would take going into the future, but instead, it's looking more uncertain, and more likely that they'll be looking to continue moving towards contention. Starting with the Atlanta Hawks, there was a lot of buzz for about 2 months before the deadline about DeJounte Murray, and possible trade locations continued to appear, with such teams being the Los Angeles Lakers, the New York Knicks, the Philadelphia 76ers, the Miami Heat, the Brooklyn Nets, and the Golden State Warriors. Fast forward to the day of the deadline, they were in trade talks with the New Orleans Pelicans in hopes of getting Herb Jones to help build a more defensive team around Trae Young, considering they were one of the worst defensive teams in the league. That trade fell through, however, and he ended up staying in Atlanta. So not only did they not trade DeJounte, but they also traded no one else, whether it was Clint Capella, who you'd have thought would have been traded by now, considering they gave their 6th overall pick on Onyeka Okongwu an extension, and yet he's still not become their solidified starter despite entering his 4th season. You drafted him up that high and will be paying him about $16 million after this year just to be a backup. You then have Saddiq Bey, who's an expiring contract, and he's been in an extremely bad slump over the course of the year, if you can even call it that. At the end of January, he was taking the most corner threes per game in the league and shooting 28%, along with not being a good defender. So are you resigning him in the offseason despite the lack of production? Recently, his play has improved before the deadline, and Landry Fields stated that upticks for Okongwu, Jalen Johnson, and Saddiq Bey were factors in staying where they were at the deadline. What's funny is that he's likely referring to the 4-game win streak that they went on prior to the deadline, where as a fan of them, I can say that they were playing better basketball, but still believe they should have made it some sort of trade. You're the 10th seed and you're trying to contend, but also want the team to stay the same despite having the ability to make changes. He even noted that he understood that the Trae and DeJounte duo wasn't working out. Yet nothing changed. So the 1 year that you have your picks, you're trying to make the playoffs, likely through the play-in because that's likely your only chance. After 2024, the Atlanta Hawks won't have their 1st-round pick until 2028. What's even funnier is that the trend has continued for the past 3 seasons. In 2022, they went on a 7-game win streak ending January and stayed put at the deadline despite the constant John Collins trade rumors. They then ended that season as the 9th seed. In the 2023 season, they went on a 5-game win streak in the middle of January and stayed put at the deadline, ending the season as the 8th seed. They then finally traded John Collins to the Jazz for Rudy Gay and a 2nd-round pick, when they should have traded him at least a season before he ended up having one of his worst seasons of his career while being on an extremely large contract. So they're in the play-in 2 years in a row and made the playoffs 2 years in a row as well. Going into 2024, they're likely repeating the same cycle just because of the opportunity to make the playoffs, when they likely will end the season as the 9th or 10th seed. You could argue that they're waiting for the offseason to look for a better deal due to DeJounte Murray's contract extension, and I can understand that. However, Capella still being on this team doesn't make much sense considering he's regressed every year since 2021. Just like John Collins, by the time you trade him, you'll get much less value than you could have, and will likely end up being a salary dump, which they've already constantly done in the past. In my opinion, there should be some sort of thought process like, if there was no play-in, Right now, we'd be out of the playoffs 2 of the last 3 years, and that mindset would push you to make some trades, whether it's building or breaking down the team. Moving on to the Brooklyn Nets. 5 years ago, we saw both Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving sign with the Nets, something that surprised everyone in the NBA world. And then the season after, they traded for James Harden, creating a big three comprised of 2 MVP caliber players and a top-tier all-star point guard. However, with injuries and Kyrie missing games due to the COVID restrictions, they only played a total of 16 games together in the regular season, going 13-3 in these games. Going into the playoffs as the second seed, they made it to the second round, but once again injuries struck with Kyrie, and Kevin Durant was left out there with an injured James Harden who was struggling to walk, resulting in a loss to the Milwaukee Bucks in 7. After some internal organizational issues, James Harden would request a trade the next season. Comprised in their previous trade to get Harden from the Rockets, they traded away 4 first-round picks and 3 pick swaps. When they traded him to the Sixers, they received just 2 firsts, with one of them being protected in 2027, Ben Simmons, Seth Curry, and Andre Drummond. Subsequently, the fallout began, and in 2023, both Kyrie and KD were traded. They still made the playoffs as a 6th seed because of how well the duo of Kyrie and KD played before the deadline, before losing to the Sixers in the first round. We're now in the 2024 season, and the Nets sit as the 11th seed without their first round pick until 2028. At the deadline, they traded Royce O'Neal away, and yet they kept both Mikal Bridges and Dorian Finney-Smith, who were players that were eyed at the deadline. There were reports that a team offered the Nets 2 firsts for Dorian Finney-Smith, which is honestly surprising, and while not believable at first, the fact that such a coveted player by many teams was not dealt at the deadline makes it feel all the more believable. Now they likely won't get as much if they look to trade him later on. With Mikal Bridges, there are also reports that the Rockets were prepared to offer them most if not all of the Nets' remaining picks back in exchange for Bridges, but the Nets were intent on building around Bridges. Whether the validity is on point, I can't be fully sure, though regardless, I can't really understand the mindset on building around him. I wouldn't personally have him as the number 1 guy on a team looking to contend, more like the second or third option at best in my opinion. If it's true that they denied a trade with the Rockets, I believe that's a missed opportunity. The one chance to get to rebuild, they decide that they'd rather look to make the play-in with the false hope of competing. Now, what exactly are they planning to do in the regular season, I don't know, but the Rockets have their pick, and who knows if they'll use that as a trade piece later on, which the Nets could have had that opportunity as well if they had gotten their picks back. While the optics of trading for your picks back is somewhat of a declaration of defeat by indirectly admitting you made a mistake, the future of your team should be more important. The last team, and probably the team with the most frustrated fans out of the 3, is the Chicago Bulls. And hey, Bulls fans, as a Hawks fan, even I feel bad for you because the malpractice that's been going on in that front office, along with the unlucky injuries that have impacted the team since 2021, it's insane. So you get your new GM and vice president in Arturas Karnisovas and Mark Eversley after the Garpax regime. If you don't know, Garpax is referring to the former Bulls GM Gar Forman and the vice president of basketball operations John Paxton. Some notable decisions they made being trading up for Doug McDermott in 2014, firing Tom Thibodeau and hiring Fred Hoiberg, signing Cristiano Felicio to a 4-year, $32 million contract, and one under-the-radar decision they made was promising to take Chandler Hutchinson at 22 during the 2018 draft, despite other talents such as Anthony Simons being available. With a breath of fresh air from your old front office, your team selects Patrick Williams 4th overall in the 2020 NBA draft. Looking back, that hasn't panned out very well, but at the very least, you traded for Nikola Vucevic, despite having to trade away Wendell Carter Jr. and 2 first-round picks, which one of those first landed the Magic Franz Wagner. You signed DeMar DeRozan and Alex Caruso, and then Lonzo Ball, making your intention to make the playoffs in the 2022 season. Going into that season, you're having an even better year than probably expected. You have Lonzo who can play on both ends, facilitating the offense along with a lockdown in Alex Caruso, and then DeMar DeRozan who's playing at a superstar level alongside Zach LaVine and Nikola Vucevic having great seasons as well. Lonzo, however, gets injured in the middle of January. Then Alex Caruso has surgery for a fractured right wrist. And while those are big hits to the team, you're still the number 2 seed at the end of February. However, right after that, you go 7-13 right after and end the season as a 6th seed, matching up against Milwaukee in the playoffs, and you don't stand a chance losing 5 games. You go into the offseason and decide that you're running back the next season, so you decide to extend Zach LaVine to a 5-year, $215 million deal, which, while he is a good player, it's questionable for a player that you probably want as a number 3 option, and you're in a season where one of your most integral players might miss the season, and that's exactly what happened. Now let's fast forward to February 9th, 2023, which was the day of the deadline. You're the 9th seed and clearly aren't as good as last year. One thing about the Bulls in 2022 was the fact that they were able to win against teams that they should win against, and what I mean by that is that they had a record of 24-9 against teams under 500. And with that, they inversely had a record of 22-27 against teams over 500. So while they were a good team, they weren't a very competitive one. With DeMar having only 2 years left on his contract, there was the choice to trade him at his best value before he was an expiring deal, and teams would be more hesitant to trade for him. There wasn't much room to build around the two since there were 4 players on the team making nearly $20 million or more, and you don't want to be unable to find a trade by next year and let him walk for nothing, right? Well, he was not traded. They went 40-42 as the 10th seed, and they lost in the play-in to the Miami Heat. You're going to another offseason off of a disappointing season, so things need to be shaken up somehow. Whether it's blowing it up or making a trade, one of these things need to happen. None of them did. Neither. Fun fact, the Chicago Bulls have not made a trade for a player since 2021. That's fun, isn't it? Their biggest decisions this offseason were re-signing Nikola Vucevic and Kobe White and signing Javon Carter. Lonzo's ruled out for the season once again, and since you didn't get better, perhaps it might be time to tear the team down and rebuild. You still own your 2024 pick, so it's probably best that you make the most of it since you won't have your first in 2025. February 8th, 2024. The Bulls are 24-27 and they're the 9th seed, sitting right in the play-in for the 2nd year in a row. The good news is that Kobe White has taken a huge leap from last year, but the bad news is that Zach LaVine is now out for the season. DeMar's contract is expiring in the offseason, and if you don't trade him now, you're either lose him for nothing or be forced to overpay him. Earlier in the offseason, the Bulls were unable to reach an extension with him. Now is the time. Make the trade. Well, I'm sure that you already know what happened after that. There was no trade made. Bulls ownership had approved a rebuild, but Arturas Karnisovas still aspired to make the playoffs, so he proceeded in the opposite direction. Now that the Bulls are on track to make the play-in, they have to make the decision whether they want to pay DeRozan or let him walk. They're in a similar situation with Alex Caruso in that he's going to be an expiring contract next season, and they didn't trade him while he's at his best value. So while it's not as if the play-in has been a complete negative and has made teams more competitive to make the playoffs instead of tanking the season because they're not at least the 8th seed, it has kept many teams in a state of mediocrity, something that the owners and front office carry the responsibility for allowing these opportunities to sway them. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Later.